on 2 different mornings, nearly 10 years apart. 2 mansions burned to the ground. One was in New Jersey, the other was in rural England. At first, both fires looked like terrible accidents. But once investigators began digging through the ashes, they discovered the same horrifying truth in both homes. The families inside had been killed before the fires even started. The flames weren't the crime. They were meant to erase it. 2 wealthy families, 2 luxury estates, 2 fires that seemed designed to destroy everything inside. But when detectives began reconstructing what really happened, they uncovered something even more disturbing. In both cases, the danger didn't come from outside the home. It came from someone inside the family. On November 20th, 2018, something happened that shook the whole of New Jersey. Around midday, smoke began rising from a large home on Willowbrook Road. Soon after, flames were pushing through the roof of the mansion. Firefighters rushed to the property, but the fire had already taken hold. At first, it looked like a terrible house fire, but inside the home were 4 members of the same family: Keith Caneiro, his wife Jennifer, their son Jesse, who was 11, and their daughter Sophia, who was 8. For the firefighters and first responders, the scene was devastating. But almost immediately, something about it didn't feel right, and investigators would soon discover something else. Just hours before this fire started, another house had already burned that same morning. That house belonged to Keith Caneiro's older brother, Paul Caneiro. His home, about 10 miles away in Ocean Township, had also caught fire earlier that day. His wife and daughters managed to escape safely, but the damage was significant. 2 fires, 2 homes, both connected to the same family. At first, the possibility seemed obvious. Maybe someone was targeting the Caneiro family. Maybe the 2 homes had been attacked. Maybe whoever started the first fire had returned for the second. But investigators would soon learn that the story was not nearly that simple. And as they began to reconstruct the timeline of that morning, the idea of a coordinated attack slowly started to fall apart. Because the fires were not the only thing investigators found at the scene. There were signs of violence, signs that the people inside the house had not died in the fire at all. And that meant the fire might have been started for a different reason entirely. To understand why that possibility mattered so much, it helps to step back for a moment. Because the Caneiro case was not the first time investigators had walked through the ashes of a burned mansion and discovered something much darker underneath. 10 years earlier, across the Atlantic Ocean, firefighters in rural England responded to another mansion fire. This one was at a large estate called Osbaston House, near the village of Maysbrook in Shropshire. The property was owned by a wealthy businessman named Christopher Foster. Like the Caneiro home, it sat in a quiet, private area surrounded by land and distance from neighbors. When the fire was finally brought under control, investigators discovered the bodies of Foster's wife, Jill, and their teenage daughter, Kirsty. Christopher Foster was also dead inside the house. At first glance, it looked like another tragic fire, but the investigation quickly revealed something different. Jill and Kirsty Foster had been shot. The fire had been started deliberately, and Christopher Foster, the millionaire owner of the estate, was responsible. He had killed his family, poured petrol through the mansion, and set the entire property on fire before dying inside. When investigators later looked at both cases, the similarities were difficult to ignore. 2 large estates, 2 families living lives that appeared comfortable and successful from the outside. And in both cases, a fire that seemed designed to destroy the house itself. Not just the building, but the evidence inside it. Investigators who study crimes like these often say that fires can tell 2 different stories. Sometimes they are accidents, but sometimes they are meant to erase what happened before the flames started. In both Colts Neck and Shropshire, the fires burned hot enough to destroy much of the homes. But not everything. Because once forensic investigators began working through the wreckage, they started to see the same pattern forming in both tragedies. These were not simple house fires. They were deliberate, carefully set, and they happened only after something much worse had already taken place. Which leads to a question investigators often ask early in cases like this. If someone burns down a mansion, what are they trying to hide? But to understand the answer to that question, we need to look closely at the people who lived in these homes. Because on the surface, both the families appeared to have everything. Successful businesses, large estates, comfortable lives. The kind of lives that, from the outside, look stable. But as the investigations would slowly reveal, appearances can hide a lot. And behind the walls of both mansions, pressure had been building for a long time. The fires didn't start the story, they ended it. So before we can figure out why those houses burned, we need to start somewhere else entirely. We need to start with the families themselves. When tragedies like these happen, the first question people usually ask is simple. Who were these families? Because before the headlines, before the investigations, before the fires, these were just ordinary lives unfolding behind large front gates and long private driveways. And in both cases, the families at the center of the story appeared, at least from the outside, to be doing very well. In Colts Neck, New Jersey, Keith Caneiro had built a life that many people would consider successful. He was a technology entrepreneur and businessman who co-owned several companies with members of his family. The work involved tech services and infrastructure projects, and over time the business had grown into something that supported multiple family members. Keith lived with his wife Jennifer and their two children, Jesse and Sophia, owned in a large home on Willowbrook Road. The property was exactly what people expect when they think about affluent suburban communities in Monmouth County. A big house surrounded by land. A quiet street lined with other large estates. A place where families moved for space, privacy, and stability. Keith and Jennifer had two children. Jesse, who was 11 years old, and Sophia, who was 8. Friends described the family as close-knit and involved in their children's lives. The kids went to school locally, and like many families in the area, their lives revolved around school, activities, and the routines of suburban life. Keith's professional life was also tied closely to his family. He worked alongside his older brother, Paul Caneiro. The two were business partners in several ventures connected to the family's companies. Their younger brother, Corey Caneiro, was also connected to parts of the business structure, although he would later remain outside the criminal investigation. For years, the Caneiro brothers had built their work and financial lives together. From the outside, it looked like a typical family-run operation. Brothers working together, shared investments, shared opportunities. But as investigators would later discover, mixing family relationships with financial interests can sometimes create tensions that stay hidden for a long time. And in the Caneiro case, those tensions were quietly growing beneath the surface. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in rural England, another family was living a life that looked equally stable. Christopher Foster lived with his wife Jill and their daughter Kirsty at a large property called Asbaston House. The estate sat in the countryside near the village of Maysbrook in Shropshire. Unlike the suburban wealth of Colts Neck, Asbaston House represented a different kind of prosperity. Rural English wealth, large land holdings, horses, private farmland stretching across the surrounding area. Christopher Foster was known locally as a wealthy businessman. His company supplied equipment used in the construction industry, and for years the business had given the impression of strong financial success. The family lived comfortably. The property itself included stables and open land, and the Fosters were known for their horses and rural lifestyle. From the outside, it looked like the kind of estate that had been built through years of steady business success. Christopher and Jill had one daughter, Kirsty, who was 15 years old. Like many teenagers in rural communities, her life revolved around school, friends, and the quiet rhythms of the countryside. People who knew the family described them as private. Not secretive exactly, just the kind of people who lived their lives mostly out of public view. And that description applies to both families in this story. They were not celebrities. They were not constantly in the public eye. They were simply families who happened to live in large homes and run successful businesses. But appearances can be misleading, because behind the scenes, both families were dealing with pressures that few people outside their inner circles fully understood. In the Caneiro family, business relationships between brothers were beginning to show signs of strain. Financial records, which investigators would later examine closely, suggested that money had been moving through company accounts in ways that raised questions. And in England, Christopher Foster's business empire was beginning to show cracks as well. The company that had supported the Foster family's wealth was quietly collapsing under the weight of growing debt. But at the time, very few people outside the financial records could see just how serious the situation had become. To friends, neighbors, and acquaintances, both families still appeared stable. Successful businesses, beautiful homes, comfortable lives. But behind those appearances, pressure was slowly building. And in both cases, that pressure would soon reach a breaking point, because just days before the fires that would destroy both mansions, something else was happening behind the scenes. Conversations, financial discoveries, and in one case, a single email that would change everything. Which leads to the next part of the story. If everything looked normal from the outside, what exactly was happening in the final days before both tragedies unfolded? When investigators later tried to understand how two families could end in such devastating ways, they didn't start with the night of the fires. They started with the days before, because in both cases, the warning signs were already there. Quiet at first, mostly hidden in financial records and private conversations, but when those details were pieced together later, a clear pattern began to emerge. In the Caneiro case, the pressure centered around money. Keith and Paul Caneiro had spent years working together through family-run businesses. On paper, it looked like a straightforward partnership between brothers. Shared companies, shared financial interests, a structure that many family businesses follow. But by late 2018, something inside those finances wasn't adding up. Investigators would later discover that money had been moving out of company accounts in ways that raised serious concerns. Financial records showed that tens of thousands of dollars had been taken from accounts connected to the business. Even more troubling, some of those funds appeared to come from trusts that had been set up for Keith's children. Those trusts were intended to help pay for Jesse and Sophia's future education. When Keith began looking more closely at the numbers, the situation quickly became personal. Because the person connected to those financial withdrawals was not a stranger. It was his own brother. For a time, the issue remained mostly behind the scenes. Family disputes over money are often handled privately, especially when businesses and relationships are deeply intertwined. But eventually, the tension reached a point where it could no longer stay quiet. On November 19, 2018, Keith Caneiro sent an email to Paul. At first glance, it looked like a business message, but the content made it clear that the situation had escalated. Keith directly confronted Paul about the missing money. The message made it clear that he believed funds had been taken improperly from company accounts and the children's trusts. And it didn't stop there. Keith also warned Paul that his salary from the business would be cut off. For investigators, that email would later become one of the most important moments in the entire timeline. because it placed the confrontation just hours before the events that followed. A financial dispute between brothers, a warning about money, and a threat to shut off a major source of income. Investigators would later argue that this message created immediate pressure, the kind of pressure that can push an already tense situation toward something far worse. But the Caneiro case wasn't the only story in which financial stress was quietly building. Across the Atlantic nearly 10 years earlier, Christopher Foster was facing a very different version of the same kind of problem. For years, Foster had been seen as a successful businessman. His company supplied equipment used in the construction industry, and the business had allowed him to build a wealthy lifestyle. The large estate, the farmland, the horses, the kind of life that suggested stability and long-term success. But by the mid-2000s, the financial foundation beneath that lifestyle had started to crumble. Between 2005 and 2007, Foster's company began struggling under increasing financial pressure. Contracts were lost, debts grew, and the business began sliding toward collapse. By 2008, the situation had become severe. Investigators later determined that Foster owed between £4 and £4.4 million. That level of debt created a situation where bankruptcy was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming unavoidable. Creditors were closing in, legal pressure was mounting, and the financial structure that had supported the Foster family's lifestyle was beginning to fall apart. People close to Foster later described a man who had become increasingly stressed. Friends said he had been struggling with insomnia. Some reports indicated he had been taking antidepressants during this period. But like many financial crises, most of the outside world still didn't see the full picture. From a distance, Osbaston House still looked like the home of a wealthy businessman. The land was still there. The house was still standing, and daily life appeared to continue as normal. Just days before the tragedy, the Foster family attended a barbecue with friends. To the people around them, nothing seemed dramatically different. But behind closed doors, the reality was very different. The business was collapsing. The debts were enormous, and the possibility of losing everything was becoming real. In both families, financial pressure had reached a critical point. In New Jersey, a brother had confronted another brother about missing money. In England, a businessman was staring down debts he could no longer repay. Neither situation had yet turned violent. But the timelines show something important. The breaking point was getting very close. Because within hours of that email in New Jersey, and within days of that summer barbecue in England, both stories would take a sudden and irreversible turn. The fires that investigators would later analyze so carefully had not started yet. But the chain of events that led to them was already in motion. And in both cases, the final hours before the tragedies began would reveal just how carefully some of those events had been set in place. So, the question investigators eventually had to answer was this: with financial pressure mounting and tensions rising, what exactly happened during the final hours before the fires began? We often say that when you look closely enough at a crime scene timeline, the night itself starts to unfold almost minute by minute. In both of these cases, the turning point came in the early hours of the morning, when most people were asleep, when the roads were quiet, and when very few witnesses were around to see what was happening. In New Jersey, the timeline begins in the early hours of November 20th, 2018. Sometime around 1:30 a.m., something unusual happened at Keith Caneiro's home on Willowbrook Road. The security cameras around the property stopped working. At first glance, that might not seem significant. Cameras fail sometimes. Systems lose power. Technical problems happen. But investigators would later determine that this wasn't an accident. The cameras had been deliberately disabled. For detectives reviewing the timeline later, that detail stood out immediately. Because once the cameras went offline, whatever happened next would no longer be recorded. About an hour and a half later, around 3 a.m., residents in the area reported hearing gunshots. The sound came from the direction of Keith Caneiro's home. The property itself sat on a large piece of land, set back from the road and surrounded by trees. That kind of layout offers privacy, but it also means that unusual sounds can easily go unnoticed or unreported in the middle of the night. But at least one neighbor heard something. Investigators would later determine that around this time, Keith Caneiro was shot outside his home. The exact moments that followed were reconstructed later through forensic evidence rather than witnesses. After Keith was killed outside, the attacker entered the house. Inside were Jennifer Caneiro and the couple's 2 children, Jesse and Sophia. All 3 were attacked inside the home. Unlike Keith, who had been shot outside, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia were killed by stabbing. The attack happened while the family was still inside their home during the early hours of the morning. Once the killings were complete, the next part of the sequence began. The house was set on fire. Investigators later determined that gasoline had been used to start the blaze. The accelerant allowed the fire to spread quickly through the home, destroying large sections of the property before firefighters would eventually arrive. At first glance, the fire looked like a devastating house fire. But as investigators would soon realize, the fire had not caused the deaths. It had happened afterward. And there was another detail that made the timeline even more unusual. Because earlier that same morning, another fire had already taken place. Roughly 10 miles away, in Ocean Township, Paul Caneiro's own home had also caught fire. That blaze started hours before the fire at Keith's house. Paul's wife and daughters managed to escape safely, but the fire still caused significant damage to the home. When investigators first saw the timeline, it raised immediate questions. 2 fires, 2 homes connected to the same family, and both happening within hours of each other. At first, it looked like someone might have targeted both households. But as detectives began reviewing surveillance footage, phone records, and movement patterns, that explanation started to look less convincing. Because the timeline of those 2 fires would eventually suggest something very different, something much more deliberate. Meanwhile, nearly a decade earlier in rural England, another night had unfolded in a disturbingly similar way. At Osbaston House, Christopher Foster's large countryside estate, the events took place during the early morning hours of August 26, 2008. Like the Caneiro case, the attacks happened while the rest of the area slept. Inside the mansion, Christopher Foster shot his wife Jill and their 15-year-old daughter Kirsty while they were asleep. The killings were carried out with a firearm that belonged to Foster himself. But the violence didn't end there. Investigators would later discover that Foster had also killed the family's dogs and several of the horses on the property. Then, according to the forensic reconstruction, he began preparing the house for fire. Large amounts of petrol were pumped throughout parts of the mansion. The driveway to the estate was blocked with a horse trailer, something investigators later believed was meant to delay emergency crews from reaching the property quickly. Once the house was saturated with fuel, the fire was started. The flames spread rapidly through the building. Christopher Foster remained inside the house as it burned. He would later die from smoke inhalation. By the time firefighters managed to reach the property and control the blaze, large sections of Osbaston House had already been destroyed. Just like the Caneiro mansion years later, the fire had torn through the home with enough force to erase much of what had happened before it. But not everything. Because fires can destroy a lot of evidence, just not all of it. And once firefighters and investigators began moving through the burned remains of both estates, they started finding clues that told a very different story from the one the flames seemed to suggest. Which brings us to the next stage of both investigations. because when first responders stepped into the ruins of those burned mansions, they quickly realized something important. These were not simply house fires, they were crime scenes. And hidden inside the wreckage were the details that would eventually reveal exactly what had happened that night. So when firefighters finally put out the flames and investigators stepped inside, the question became unavoidable. What evidence had survived the fire? When firefighters arrive at a house fire, their first job is always the same. Put the fire out, search the structure, make sure no one is still inside. But once the flames are under control, another kind of investigation begins. Fire investigators and detectives start asking a different set of questions. Where did the fire start? How did it spread? And most importantly, was it an accident? At the Caneiro mansion in Colt's Neck, firefighters quickly realized something was wrong. The fire itself had spread aggressively through the home. Large sections of the house were already heavily damaged by the time crews arrived. But as firefighters moved through the structure, they began finding something far more troubling than fire damage. There were victims inside, 4 of them. Keith Caneiro was found outside the home. His body had been discovered near the property before firefighters even entered the house. Inside the burned structure were the bodies of Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia. Almost immediately, investigators noticed something that changed the direction of the entire case. The victims had not died from the fire. They had been killed before the flames started. That discovery transformed the scene from a fire investigation into a homicide investigation. Detectives from the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office began working alongside fire investigators to reconstruct what had happened. And very quickly, another detail pushed the case in an unusual direction. The fire at Keith Caneiro's house was not the only one that day. Earlier that same morning, another fire had been reported about 10 miles away in Ocean Township. That house belonged to Paul Caneiro. At first, the 2 fires seemed like they might be connected through an outside threat. 2 homes, same family, same morning. It was natural for investigators to wonder if someone had targeted both properties. But investigators know that coincidences in criminal cases often deserve closer attention. So, detectives began examining the timeline carefully. When exactly had each fire started? Who had been at each location? And what movements could be confirmed between the 2 scenes? One of the first tools investigators turned to was surveillance footage. Even though the security cameras at Keith's house had been disabled earlier that morning, the surrounding area still had other cameras. Traffic cameras, private security systems from nearby properties, cameras from businesses and intersections along the roads connecting the 2 homes. Investigators began gathering any footage that might show vehicles moving through the area during the early morning hours. At the same time, forensic teams started examining what remained of the burned mansion itself. Fire investigators specialize in identifying the origin and cause of fires, even when structures have been heavily damaged. They look for burn patterns, chemical traces, and the way heat traveled through the structure. In the Caneiro home, those patterns suggested something important. The fire had been deliberately set. Accelerants had been used to help it spread, which meant the fire wasn't just a tragic result of what happened inside the house. It was part of the sequence. Meanwhile, nearly 10 years earlier in England, investigators had reached similar conclusions at Osbaston House. When firefighters first arrived at the Foster estate, the flames had already consumed large parts of the mansion. But as fire investigators examined the wreckage, they quickly noticed clear signs that petrol had been used throughout the building. The fire had been fueled intentionally. Then came the ballistic evidence. When the bodies of Jill and Kirsty Foster were examined, investigators confirmed that both had been shot. Testing later showed that the same firearm had been used in both killings. That weapon belonged to Christopher Foster. But there was another detail that caught investigators' attention. The driveway leading to the estate had been blocked by a large horse trailer. At first glance, that might seem like a random obstacle. But investigators soon realized the positioning of the trailer had a very specific effect. It slowed emergency responders. Fire crews could not immediately drive straight to the house. Instead, they had to navigate around the blockage before reaching the burning building. In fires, even a few minutes can make a major difference. And for investigators, that raised another possibility. The obstruction may have been placed there intentionally, to delay help. When investigators stepped back and looked at the evidence in both cases, a similar pattern was starting to appear. Violence inside the home. A fire started afterward. And in both cases, signs that the fires may have been meant to do more than just burn the building. They may have been meant to erase what happened before the flames began. But fire investigators are trained to work through destruction. Even after intense heat and collapsed structures, small pieces of evidence can survive. And once forensic teams began examining those pieces closely, they started finding details that suggested something even more troubling. Because the evidence wasn't just pointing to murder, it was pointing to planning. Careful steps taken before the attacks ever began, which leads to the next phase of the investigation. Because as detectives and forensic experts dug deeper into the evidence, they began uncovering details that suggested these crimes had not been impulsive acts at all. They looked organized, deliberate, almost methodical. So, the next question investigators had to answer was this: what pieces of evidence started revealing the plan behind the fires? In many investigations, there's a moment when the evidence starts shifting the direction of the case. At first, detectives gather information broadly. They look at every possibility: accidents, outside attackers, random violence. But eventually, certain details begin to line up in ways that are difficult to ignore. In the Caneiro investigation, that turning point came as forensic teams and detectives began piecing together the physical evidence from both homes. One of the first major developments involved ballistics. Keith Caneiro had been shot outside his home, and investigators worked to determine what weapon had been used. Ballistic analysis allows experts to compare bullets and shell casings with specific firearms, identifying whether they came from the same gun. In this case, the testing began pointing toward a weapon connected to Paul Caneiro. That alone wasn't enough to prove anything yet, but it was a significant development. Then came the DNA evidence. Investigators recovered gloves and pieces of clothing connected to the events of that morning. When those items were examined, DNA evidence linked them to Paul Caneiro. Again, this didn't tell the entire story on its own, but it was another piece of a puzzle that was beginning to form. At the same time, detectives were reviewing surveillance footage gathered from roads and properties around Colts Neck and Ocean Township. Even though the cameras at Keith's house had been disabled earlier that morning, cameras elsewhere in the area were still recording. Those cameras began capturing something important: the movement of Paul Caneiro's vehicle during key points in the timeline. Investigators tracked when the vehicle appeared near certain roads and intersections, and when it moved between locations. When those movements were compared with the timeline of the two fires, the pattern raised serious questions. Because the vehicle appeared to be traveling between the two properties during the hours when the crimes occurred. Another detail investigators focused on was the security system at Keith Caneiro's home. Earlier in the morning, around 1:30 a.m., the cameras had been disabled. When technicians examined the system later, they determined the shutdown had not been caused by a malfunction. It had been done intentionally. Someone had taken steps to make sure the cameras would not record what happened next. But perhaps the most powerful evidence investigators uncovered came from financial records. As detectives dug deeper into the Caneiro family businesses, They found documentation showing that tens of thousands of dollars had been taken from company accounts. Some of the money had also been pulled from trusts connected to Keith's children. These findings helped establish a possible motive. Money had gone missing. Keith had confronted Paul about it just hours before the murders, and the financial records suggested the dispute had been growing more serious over time. When investigators looked at all of this together, ballistics, DNA, surveillance footage, and financial documents, the picture was becoming clearer. The investigation in England had uncovered its own disturbing details years too. At Osbaston House, fire investigators confirmed that petrol had been pumped throughout large sections of the mansion before the fire started. This wasn't a small amount of accelerant. Large quantities had been distributed across the house, ensuring that the flames would spread rapidly once the fire began. Ballistic testing in that case also provided clear answers. The firearm used to kill Jill and Kirsty Foster belonged to Christopher Foster. The same weapon was responsible for both killings. But investigators also discovered something else that revealed how much preparation had taken place before the fire. Several of the family's animals had been killed before the blaze. The Foster family's dogs were found dead, and several horses on the property had also been shot. For investigators, this detail was particularly telling. It suggested that the violence had not been impulsive. Instead, it appeared to be part of a larger sequence of deliberate actions carried out before the fire began. Then there was the blocked driveway. The horse trailer placed across the entrance to the property had forced firefighters to slow down as they approached the burning house. That kind of delay might only last a few minutes. But when a house is on fire, even a short delay, like I said, can allow flames to spread much further. When investigators stepped back and looked at all the evidence from both cases, they began to see a similar pattern forming. The crimes were not chaotic. They were structured. Steps had been taken before the violence. Steps had been taken after the violence. And in both cases, the fires appeared to be the final stage. A way to destroy the home and potentially eliminate evidence. But by this point in the investigations, detectives were no longer asking whether the fires had been deliberate. That question had already been answered. Now, they were asking something else. Because once the forensic evidence started pointing toward specific people, the investigation naturally moved in a new direction. Detectives needed to know who had both the motive and the opportunity to carry out crimes like these. And that leads to the next phase of the investigation. Because once investigators started focusing on individuals connected to the victims, the spotlight quickly narrowed. And the question became unavoidable. Who actually stood to gain from these tragedies, and who had the chance to make them happen? As the evidence began lining up, investigators moved into the stage of the case where attention starts narrowing. At the beginning of any major investigation, detectives cast a wide net. They consider strangers, business associates, possible enemies, and anyone who might have had contact with the victims. But over time, certain names begin appearing again and again in the timeline. Certain movements match the evidence. Certain motives begin to stand out. In the Caneiro investigation, that process gradually led detectives back to someone who had been connected to the case from the very beginning: Paul Caneiro. At first, Paul had been seen as another victim in a strange and frightening situation. After all, his own house had caught fire earlier that same morning. His wife and daughters had escaped the blaze, but the fire had still caused significant damage to the home. In those early hours, it seemed possible that both Caneiro brothers had been targeted. But the deeper investigators looked into it, the more that theory started to fall apart. Surveillance footage gathered from roads and intersections placed Paul Caneiro's vehicle in key locations during the early morning hours. The movements of that vehicle became difficult to ignore. It appeared near the area of Keith's home around the time investigators believed the attack had taken place. And it appeared again along routes that connected both properties. When detectives compared those movements with the timeline of the fires, something began to look different. The fire at Paul Caneiro's own home no longer looked like part of an outside attack. Instead, investigators began considering another possibility: that the fire at Paul's house had been staged. In other words, it might not have been an attempt to harm him or his family. It might have been an attempt to create an alibi. If two houses burned on the same morning, it could initially suggest that someone was targeting the Caneiro family as a whole. But once investigators started reconstructing the exact sequence of events, the theory began shifting. Detectives also began taking a closer look at the business relationship between Paul and Keith. Family businesses can be complicated, especially when large amounts of money are involved. Over time, financial disagreements between partners can quietly grow into serious disputes. In this case, investigators already had a key piece of evidence: the email Keith sent to Paul on November 19th. That message directly confronted Paul about missing money from company accounts and trusts connected to Keith's children. It also warned that Paul's salary from the business would be cut off. For detectives, the timing of that email mattered. It had been sent just hours before the murders. When investigators looked at everything together, the financial records, the vehicle movements, the disabled security cameras, and the staged fire at Paul's own home, the case was beginning to take shape. 9 days after the murders, on November 29, 2018, Paul Caneiro was arrested. Prosecutors would later charge him with the murders of his brother Keith, his sister-in-law Jennifer, and his niece and nephew Jesse and Sophia. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, investigators in England had reached their own conclusions years earlier in the Foster case. At Osbaston House, the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward Christopher Foster. The firearm used in the murders belonged to him. Ballistic testing confirmed it was the weapon that killed both Jill and Kirsty. The positioning of the horse trailer blocking the driveway suggested deliberate preparation, and the fire itself had been carefully fueled with petrol throughout the house. But perhaps the most powerful piece of the investigation involved Foster's finances. When authorities examined his business records, they discovered the full extent of his financial collapse. His company had failed. His debts had grown into the millions, and bankruptcy was closing in rapidly. Investigators concluded that Christopher Foster had carried out the killings and set the fire himself before dying inside the burning house. 2 separate cases, 2 different countries, 2 families destroyed. And in both investigations, the evidence eventually narrowed towards someone inside the family itself. But identifying who committed the crime is only part of the story. The harder question is often the one that comes next. Because when investigators believe they know who carried out the violence, they still have to understand why. Why someone would cross the line from financial pressure into something far more devastating. Why someone would destroy not just a home, but an entire family. And that question leads directly to the next part of the investigation. Because once detectives believed they had identified the people responsible, they began looking deeper into motive. And the question they needed to answer was this: what could drive someone to commit a crime like this? By the time investigators believe they know who committed a crime, the investigation often shifts to a different kind of question. Not just who did it, but why. Because in cases involving family members, that question becomes especially difficult to answer. These aren't strangers crossing paths in a moment of violence. These are people who shared homes, businesses, holidays, and years of history. Understanding the motive means looking closely at what was happening behind the scenes. In the Caneiro case, prosecutors argued that the motive came down to a combination of financial pressure and the fear of being exposed. The investigation into the family businesses had already uncovered something important. Money had gone missing. Financial records showed that tens of thousands of dollars had been taken from company accounts. Some of those withdrawals were connected to trust funds that had been set up for Keith Caneiro's children. Those discoveries created a serious conflict between the two brothers. For years, Keith and Paul had worked together in their shared businesses. But once the missing money came to light, that relationship began to break down. The email Keith sent on November 19, 2018, became one of the most significant moments in the case. In that message, Keith directly confronted Paul about the missing funds. But it didn't stop there. Keith also warned Paul that his salary from the family business would be cut off. For prosecutors, that detail mattered, because it meant the confrontation didn't just involve accusations. It involved immediate financial consequences. If Paul lost his salary and faced exposure over the missing money, it could have meant serious personal and legal trouble. Investigators also examined another possible financial factor. Keith Caneiro reportedly had a life insurance policy valued at around $3 million. Prosecutors later suggested that Paul may have believed he could benefit financially if his brother died. Whether that expectation was realistic or not became part of the broader discussion around motive. But taken together, investigators believed the financial pressures were building toward a breaking point. A business dispute, missing funds, a confrontation between brothers, and the threat of losing both income and reputation. In the Foster case, the financial situation was different in structure but similar in intensity. Christopher Foster had spent years building a successful company, supplying equipment to the construction industry. For a long time, the business supported the lifestyle that surrounded Osbaston House. The estate, the land, the horses, and the appearance of long-term prosperity. But by the mid-2000s, the company had begun to fail. Contracts were lost, debt accumulated, and the financial structure supporting the business started collapsing. By 2008, the numbers had become overwhelming. Investigators later found that Foster owed somewhere between £4 million and £4.4 million. That level of debt meant the situation was approaching a point where it could no longer be managed quietly. Bankruptcy was becoming unavoidable. If bankruptcy went forward, it would likely mean losing Osbaston House and much of the wealth Foster had built over the years. For someone who had spent decades constructing that lifestyle, the collapse would not only be financial, it would also be public. Investigators later concluded that Christopher Foster feared both financial ruin and the humiliation that would follow. Reports from people who knew him suggested he had been struggling emotionally during this period. Friends described stress, sleeplessness, and growing pressure as creditors moved closer. In cases like these, investigators sometimes refer to a pattern known as family annihilation. It's a rare but documented type of crime where a person facing extreme pressure believes destroying the family is somehow a solution to the crisis they are facing. In many of those cases, the motive involves a mixture of financial collapse, fear of exposure, and a desire to control the outcome rather than face public failure. But even when investigators develop these explanations, they don't always answer every question. Because motive explains pressure. It explains conflict. But it doesn't always explain how someone crosses the final line into violence. And in both the Caneiro and Foster cases, there were still details that investigators struggled to fully understand. Details about planning, details about timing, and details about the decisions made in those final hours before the fires began. Which brings us to the next part of the story. Because even after investigators identified suspects and established motives, certain pieces of the timeline continued to raise questions. Questions that, even today, don't have perfectly clear answers. So the next question becomes this: what parts of these cases still don't fully make sense? Where do these cases stand today?
Years can pass between a crime and its final legal resolution. Evidence has to be analyzed, charges are filed, motions are argued in court, trials are delayed, sometimes repeatedly, as the legal system slowly moves forward. That's exactly what happened in the Caneiro case. The murders took place in November 2018, but the trial did not begin until January 12, 2026. By the time the courtroom proceedings started, investigators had spent years building the case. Prosecutors had gathered surveillance footage, forensic evidence, financial documents, and testimony that they believed showed exactly what happened during the early hours of November 20th. During the trial, prosecutors presented a detailed timeline. They showed how security cameras at Keith Caneiro's home had been disabled in the early morning hours. They walked jurors through surveillance footage that tracked vehicle movements between Ocean Township and Colts Neck. They presented ballistic evidence connected to the weapon used to kill Keith. They introduced DNA evidence recovered from gloves and clothing tied to the events of that morning. And they showed financial records that documented the dispute between Keith and his brother Paul over missing funds from company accounts and trust funds meant for the children's education. For prosecutors, the argument was straightforward. Paul Caneiro had faced exposure over the missing money and the loss of his income from the family business. According to their case, the confrontation from the night before created immediate pressure, and the crimes that followed were a calculated attempt to eliminate that threat. The defense challenged parts of that narrative during the trial, but after weeks of testimony and evidence, the case eventually went to the jury. On February 13, 2026, the jury returned its verdict. Paul Caneiro was found guilty of murdering his brother Keith, his sister-in-law Jennifer, and his niece and nephew, Jesse and Sophia. The verdict marked the end of a long and complex legal process that had stretched nearly 8 years from the night of the crime. Sentencing is scheduled for May 12, 2026. Even with the legal case approaching its conclusion, the impact of the tragedy continues to be felt in the community. Colts Neck is still the same quiet town it was before the murders. The tree-lined roads are still there. The large estates are still spread across the countryside, but for many residents, the Caneiro case remains one of the most disturbing events the area has ever experienced. 4 members of the same family were killed in a home that many neighbors had passed by countless times without ever imagining what would eventually happen there. Across the Atlantic, the Foster case in England reached its conclusion much earlier. After investigators completed their examination of Osbaston House, they determined that Christopher Foster had killed his wife Jill and daughter Kirsty before setting the mansion on fire. He died inside the house from smoke inhalation. Because the perpetrator was dead, there was no trial. The case was officially closed once the investigation confirmed the sequence of events. But the tragedy left a lasting impact on the local community in Shropshire. Osbaston House had once been a symbol of prosperity in the area. After the fire, it became a reminder of how quickly things can unravel behind closed doors. Both cases have since been studied by investigators, criminologists, and legal experts as examples of extreme family violence tied to financial pressure. They've also sparked broader conversations about financial transparency in family businesses, about mental health during periods of financial collapse, and about how often serious personal crises remain hidden from the outside world until it's too late. In both tragedies, the fires destroyed the physical structures where the crimes occurred. Walls collapsed, rooms were reduced to ash, and many pieces of evidence disappeared in the flames. But the investigations that followed managed to reconstruct what happened. They revealed the sequence of events, the motives behind the crimes, and the devastating consequences that followed. Still, even with the cases largely resolved, one uncomfortable reality remains. From the outside, both families appeared to have stable, successful lives. Large homes, thriving businesses, comfortable lifestyles. But behind those appearances, financial stress and personal pressure had been quietly building for years. And in both cases, that pressure eventually exploded into violence that destroyed entire families. The fires that followed may have been intended to erase what happened inside those homes, but they couldn't erase the questions those tragedies leave behind. Because when investigators step back and look at cases like these, one thought keeps returning. How many warning signs were there? And how many of them went unnoticed until it was far too late?